Good afternoon to you all, and you're very welcome. And as Luke said, this Sunday in Lent is always the Sunday in which we hear the Gospel of the Transfiguration, and you'll have heard that at Mass earlier today. And so the talk this week is loosely based on that Gospel, the Transfiguration. Very shortly after I was ordained a priest, way back in 1995, I was sent for a summer to help out in a small parish in North Clare. The parish priest had had an accident a few weeks previously. He had snapped his Achilles tendon, and he needed some weeks to recover. And I happened to be around during that summer with very little to do because I was due to go back to Rome to finish my studies. And so I was sent there to be his replacement for the summer. There wasn't really a whole lot to do there during the summer, except say Mass, do a few funerals that happened, and the odd baptism. But my abiding memory of that time is the 8 a.m. Mass every Sunday morning. There was only one man who used to sit in the gallery at the back of the church on his own every week. And once the readings were over and the homily began, every single week he'd pick up the newspaper and he'd start to read it. And when the homily was over, he'd fold it up and put it down in the seat beside him and start to pay attention again. And this happened, as I said, every single week. The only saving grace for me in all of this was that I was assured by the sacristan on the first day that he did this no matter who was saying Mass. It was just what he did. Now, in thinking about Lent and the Lenten talk this year, for some strange reason that man came into my head. I hadn't thought about him for years, and for all I know, he may now very well be reading his newspaper in heaven. But in reminiscing about him all of those years ago, I became aware of a rather uncomfortable truth. I am now that man myself. Every day I hear the word of the Lord addressed to me. And every day I reply, "Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ." But how often do I really listen to it? Now, this may be partially due to distractedness, but surely also there's an element of resistance. I'm now old enough to know that if I were to really listen, my life would have to be turned upside down. I'm sure you've noticed that we're often very keen to tell everyone else what we ourselves know. But we're very slow to listen so that we might learn something new. There's a story told of a young scientist who gave a factory tour to Lord Kelvin back in the late 19th century. Lord Kelvin was arguably one of the greatest scientists of his time. The factory created equipment that measured the effects of electricity, and it had been built by Lord Kelvin himself. Unfortunately, the young man giving the tour wasn't aware of this fact. And after he had spoken in great detail about the factory and what was made there and how these gadgets measured electricity and so on, Lord Kelvin complimented him on his tour. But he wanted to ask one question of the guide. He said, "What is electricity?" And when the young man was unable to answer his question, Lord Kelvin consoled him by explaining that both he and Lord Kelvin were equally ignorant of the answer to this question. We often don't even know what questions need answering. We need to pay far more attention, and we need to listen. Do you remember the account in the Gospels of Jesus going up to Jerusalem? How he told them that he was on his way there to suffer, to die, and to rise again. But they simply did not want to know. Well, that's me. And perhaps it might be you as well. And what happens in this account? Well, we heard it today at Mass. Jesus is rather dramatically transfigured in their sight. And a voice cries out to them on the mountain, "Listen to him." Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to make his exodus into a freedom which infinitely transcends that given to Israel when she left the bondage of Egypt. He invites the disciples to accompany him freely on this journey, out of the bondage of sin and death. But like the rest of us, they are afraid. For I may long for that infinity of love, which is God's own life, but also fear its fire. I may thirst for God's unbounded freedom, but freedom can be frightening. Every year, we hear this Transfiguration Gospel on the Second Sunday of Lent. And it's placed on this Sunday near the start of Lent for a reason. This is what Lent is actually about. As well as your ashes that you get on Ash Wednesday, you need a crash helmet if you're going to take it seriously. Freedom, any kind of freedom, is a costly business. As the people in Ukraine and in the Middle East are showing us every day. There is no such thing as a free ride into the promised land. You and I have to roll up our sleeves and get to work if we really want it. Have you ever stopped to wonder what the Transfiguration is doing at the start of Lent? Why, in the midst of a season of prayer, fasting, and penance, with its somber purple colour, does the Church present us with this image of Jesus in garments becoming glistening, intensely white, as no fuller on earth could bleach them. Wouldn't that better fit the mood of Easter time, when the earth is bid to be glad as glory floods her, ablaze with light from her eternal King? And when the liturgical colour happens to be white, like the colour of Christ's robes at the Transfiguration. So why do we read this at the start of Lent? And indeed, many commentators on this episode in the Gospel do interpret it precisely as a vision of the risen Jesus, pointing forward either to his resurrection or even to his second coming. In the context of Lent, however, it reminds us of something else. Something which, in the context of Lent, is of vital importance. The importance of listening. Listening in the first place to the Word of God. Listening to the voice of the Holy Spirit in my life. Listening to the cry of the poor and the needy. Listening to my own thoughts, to my own pain, and my own need for God. Listening to all of these different things and then doing something about it. That's why it's at the start of Lent. We have so many different ways to listen today. There are so many different gadgets available to us, are there not? So many different means of communication. Mobile phones, iPads, tablets, laptops, social media apps, and then the old-fashioned ways, letters, cards, books, and let's not forget conversations. And I could go on and on and on. I'm not sure, though, that we have actually become better listeners, despite all the different ways of communicating that we have. I don't see much evidence of that looking around the world at the moment. People seem to end up in conflict much more readily than they do in dialogue. All the Light We Cannot See is a 2014 war novel written by a man called Anthony Doerr. And it's set during World War II. And it centers on two characters. Marie-Laure Leblanc, a blind French girl who takes refuge in her uncle's house in Saint-Malo after Paris is invaded by the Nazis. And the other character, Werner Fenning, a German boy who's accepted into a military school because of his skills in radio technology before he was sent off to serve in the army. The novel was published in 2014 with a print run of 60,000 copies. By September 2021, it had sold over 15 million copies. And since, it has also been made into a TV miniseries. The inspiration for the book came from a 2004 train ride, during which Doerr, the author, watched a man become angry in his train carriage because his mobile phone cut out when they went into a tunnel. He felt the man was being unreceptive to the miracle of being able to communicate across such long distances. And he decided to set his novel on this theme. In World War II, with a focus on the Battle of San Malo after a book trip he made to that town in 2005. And this novel shows how important communication can be, if it is real communication, with real listening. All of the important communication in the novel begins first with listening. This is always the case. Strangers can develop a bond, and that bond can become a love, and that love can become transformative. How much more is that the case when this communication happens to come to us through the Word of God? How much more is this the case when the communication comes to us through the person of Jesus Christ? We're probably in a better place today than at any time in the past to appreciate just how wide-ranging an exercise of listening can be. Likewise, if we stop listening to what we find hard to take, then we're likely to pass God by without even noticing that he was there. There's something, I think, particularly beautiful about the description which Anthony Bloom gives of the very first time he really listened to the scriptures. And this is what he says. While I was reading the beginning of St. Mark's Gospel, before I reached the 3rd chapter, I became aware of a presence. I saw nothing, I heard nothing, but it was no hallucination. It was a simple certainty that the Lord was standing there and that I was in the presence of him whose life I had begun to read with such revulsion and ill will. This was my basic and essential meeting with the Lord. From then, I knew that Christ did exist. I knew that he was the risen Christ. I met with the core of the Christian message. That message which St. Paul formulated so sharply and clearly when he said, "If Christ is not risen, we are the most miserable of all people." Christ was the risen Christ for me, because if the one who had died nearly 2,000 years before was there alive, he was the risen Christ. We read in the sayings of the Desert Fathers, Abba Lot came to Abba Joseph and said, "Father, according as I am able, I keep my little rule and my little fast, my prayer, meditation, and contemplative silence. And according as I am able, I strive to cleanse my heart of evil thoughts. Now, what more should I do?" The elder rose up in reply and stretched out his hands to heaven, and his fingers became like 10 lamps of fire. And he said, "Why not be totally changed into fire?" This is Lent, and this is the work of Lent. And what do we need to accomplish this work? This listening? Well, the first tool that I suggest to you is patience. Something we're not very good at all today. It's in very short supply. There are very few really patient people around today. It's not part of the DNA of the 21st century. Nobody is willing to wait for anything anymore. Nobody wants to do 40 days in the desert. We all want to opt for the intensive 4-day option instead. But that's not how these things work, I'm afraid. This is completely contrary to the modern mindset. There are no shortcuts. It takes time, lots and lots of time. Going back to our friends, the Desert Fathers, we read, an elder said, "The reason why we do not get anywhere is that we do not know our limits, and we're not patient in carrying out the work we have begun. But without any labour at all, we want to gain possession of virtue." Obviously, impatience has been a problem facing Christians from very early times. And this brings us to our second tool, stability. Anthony Bloom also has a very useful paragraph on stability that I'd like to read to you. He says, "What is it then to be stable? It seems to me that it may be described in the following terms. You will find stability when you discover that God is everywhere, that you do not need to seek him elsewhere, that he is here. And if you do not find him here, it's useless to go and search for him elsewhere, because it is not him that is absent from us. It is we who are absent from him." And this is important because it is only at the moment that you recognize this that you can truly find the fullness of the kingdom of God in all its richness within you. That God is present in every situation and in every place, that you will be able to say, "So then, I shall stay where I am." When we begin to understand this, we can then also understand what St. Anselm meant when he wrote, "Lord my God, you have formed me and reformed me." Or when we call to mind the story of the monk who was asked, "What do you do there all day in the monastery?" And he replied, "We fall and get up, fall and get up, fall and get up again." In speaking of tools, let's not forget those St. Benedict himself has provided in his rule. During these days of Lent, it's well worth our while reading and rereading chapter 4 of St. Benedict's Rule, the tools of good works. He says, first of all, love the Lord your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, and all your strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. Then the following: you are not to kill, not to commit adultery, not to steal nor to covet. You are not to bear false witness, and so on. In short, our way of acting has to be different because we have been listening to the Word. In all of this, we shouldn't forget the words either of St. John Climacus, who said, God gives prayer to the one who prays. We're not alone on our Lenten journey. We do this with God, and we do it as part of a community. The only obstacle preventing all of this from happening is the person you see every morning in the mirror when you get up. The difficulty is that I can will what God does not will. I can ignore God's call in my life. I am capable of rejecting God's advice, even rejecting his love. I can, in fact, bring about my own destruction. And this is what St. Benedict means by disobedience. And why right at the very beginning of his rule for monks, he calls all of us who want to be monks to obedience. And as you may know, the Latin root of the word obedience lies in listening to. And so we're back again to attentive listening. We need God in our lives. As Isaiah says, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. God preserve us all from thinking that we can rely on our own wisdom. The way of humility opens us to a real listening to God. This is, in its very simplest form, the way of monastic life too. The way of St. Benedict. And it's also a distillation of the Christian life itself. Nothing great is ever achieved without much enduring, said Catherine of Siena. Lent is a time for going very deeply into ourselves. What is it that stands between me and my God? Between me and my brothers and sisters? Between me and life, the life of the Holy Spirit? Whatever that is, let us relentlessly tear it out, without a moment's hesitation. Thomas Merton once remarked that Ash Wednesday is full of joy. The sources of all sorrow is the illusion that of ourselves we are anything but dust. We are our own biggest problem. So during Lent, let us find concrete ways to overcome our indifference, or we'll end up like the man reading the newspaper in the gallery, week after week, Lent after Lent. And in doing this, let us not forget the traditional tools of Lenten warfare: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. What can we say of prayer? Only seek a relationship when you pray, not answers. Because you won't always find answers, but you will always find God. Remember too what St. Augustine said long ago. Do you wish your prayer to fly towards God? Make for it two wings: fasting and almsgiving. Fasting cleanses the soul, raises the mind. It has been said that these three tools of Lent are really one, manifested in three different ways. Prayer without fasting is like walking on one leg. Fasting without prayer is what we nowadays call dieting. And they are not the same thing at all. Fasting confirms our utter dependence upon God by finding in Him a source of sustenance beyond food. However, the best synthesis of this triple unity, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, is that captured by St. Peter Chrysologus. He said, "Fasting is the soul of prayer. Mercy is the lifeblood of fasting. So if you pray, fast. If you fast, show mercy. If you want your petition to be heard, hear the petition of others. If you do not close your ears to others, you open God's ear to yourself." Lent stimulates us to let the Word of God penetrate our life, and in this way, to know the fundamental truth: who we are, where we come from, where we must go, and what path we must take on life. So put down the newspaper during these days of Lent. Take up the Scriptures and open them. Open your ears, your mind, and your heart to what you hear when you read from these sacred pages. And above all, listen to Him. Thank you.